Hi, so this is really what the main point of what I want to be doing, which is I want people to know my stories, and I'm fiction. I need to tell my stories. I'm hoping that through these videos, I'll be able to sell more books and raise money to publish the stories that I have inside of me. I've published The Hope Merchant, which is a lovely, lovely story about hope and about how life is all about connecting. I've also published a collection of short stories, which is what I'm going to be reading from today, called Dolphins on the Moon. Um, you can get these on Amazon. Also, a book which is 90% autobiographical, um, called Master of Return in the 11th Light. That's pretty much a factual account of what it's like to live in Gush Etzion as a Jew trying to find God and meeting amazingly holy people and then watching them get murdered because they're Jews. Um, that's what that's about. So if any of these appeal to you, please go on to Amazon and order them. What I will be doing is when I have enough stories read online that I feel are good and that people have told me, yeah, I want to read this. Uh, um, I'm gonna put together another collection of short stories. In the meantime, if you want to read it, I'll be happy to send you an electronic version of any of my stories and books and anything. I've done that already. People just write me an email to Eliyahu, Eliyahuu, at wrestlingtheangel.com. I'll be happy to send you an electronic copy of a story or a book. In the meantime, last week I read a conversation on Central Park South. What I'd like to read now, oh gosh, I love these stories. So I guess I'll read them in order, though they're very precious. This is a story called Vic. And if anyone wants to know, this is actually it's a true story. It's a story that happened the summer before I moved to Israel, which would make it in 1991. I was still very much a biker and non-religious and not really sure of what I was going to do with my life. I was 30 years old. Um, and my father was working in a pharmacy in the hospital. My father, blessed memory. Um, and though I didn't really do deliveries of pharmaceuticals, which you don't do, um, Vic did live across the street from us. And my father did tell me about Vic's illness. So the story is called Vic Delivers. Vic was old when I first met him. Back then, I was a confused post-adolescent. I'm going to be editing as I read, so you're part of the process. A half dozen years later, I'd grown like a stunted tree with poisoned roots into a surly young man. When I came back to live with my parents, I found the years hadn't affected Vic nearly as much, if at all. He was bald with no facial hair, so going gray barely affected his appearance. His skin barely showed any worry lines. The only visible change seemed to be that he had grown smaller, or perhaps the world had grown larger around him. I wasn't sure which. There never seemed to be too much to him, and a good wind would surely have blown him away. His skin was pearly white, and I could practically see right through it, like old parchment with thick writing showing through. His eyes were a washed out blue that must have faded over the years, because I couldn't imagine seeing that particular shade in a young man's eyes. Even so, he was a tiny old man, which in so many ways made him look like a child. He had a simple smile and eyes full of awe and wonder every time I saw him. He was part of the landscape of my parents' beach home, just a smiling old guy next door, endlessly raking the same spot in his front yard, like an animated lawn ornament programmed to turn and wave whenever I drove past. Angry young men had no use for such items, so I paid him no mind. My life had been fraying at the edges, spiraling down ever since I moved away to the city. I got fired from my job just about the same time as my lease ran out. The neighborhood was gentrifying, and I clearly wasn't. I knew what I needed to do, but I just couldn't work up the mouthful of spit needed to go job and apartment hunting. In my mind, it was one or the other. Since it had to be both, I decided it would be neither. I toyed with the idea of becoming homeless, but it seemed like too much effort. Without asking, my folks went out and found me a summer job working maintenance at the local hospital. I hated the idea and told them so, but 1 week before my landlord was scheduled to come knocking on my door, I decided pushing a mop and sleeping in my old bedroom was better than the available options in the city. My mom dusted out my old bedroom, and as simple as that, the decision was made. Moving out my old digs was depressingly simple. Most of my apartment was full of junk I'd been meaning to throw away and replace. My clothes and a few other almost essentials fit into the trunk of my dad's car. I followed him down the Garden State Parkway on my motorcycle, cruising slowly, tucked into the slipstream behind his big sedan. Long Beach Island was packed for the summer, but hanging out with the college crowd didn't appeal to me. Though I was only a few years older, I lived in a separate universe. They were happy and optimistic about the future. The shiny young families were even worse. It was the future I was raised to desire. Maybe I still did want it. But whenever I saw a family happy together, vacationing, playing on the beach with colorful toys and a neatly spread blanket, a thick slab of glass slid down between us. I was separated from my preferred future by an invisible wall of impossibility and despair. I suspected that the wall was of my own making, but that implied an uncomfortable level of self-loathing. Instead, I convinced myself that I preferred solitude. I slid into a numbing routine. In the morning, I went from my folks' place to the hospital, pushed a mop around for a few hours. I wore a baseball hat low on my forehead to avoid necessary eye contact. In the evening, I went back to my bedroom and read. I didn't hang out with anyone that summer, but I saw Vic just about every afternoon working in his garden. Vic's garden was a small square of dirt hemmed in by concrete that seemed to be growing faster than his scrawny tomato plants. I couldn't figure out what he spent his time doing, but that tiny plot of dirt sure kept him busy. It was pretty sparse, making his daily routine seem pathetic, but for some reason I liked watching him. Maybe I imagined him to be the only person on the island more pathetic than me. Whatever the reason, this tiny man with a whispery voice made my anger disappear every time he looked at me. It was the only bit of human contact I had that summer, and I surprised myself by not hating it. Vic didn't seem to notice that I was a beefy guy with a black leather jacket and too many earrings on a bike that was too loud and an attitude that was even worse. Every time I rode past, I looked over to see him scratching away at the dust, and he would always look up and smile and wave. I got in the habit of waving back. It wasn't what most people would call friendship, but since that was the full extent of what I could handle, it was in its own way, and I began to like it. One day I found out a little bit more about Vic than I should have. I was mopping up the floors near the pharmacy, and the pharmacist asked me if I could drop off a bottle of pills in my neighborhood. He was a friend of my folks, so I sort of knew him, but it was a strange request. I didn't think he was allowed to just pass pills along, especially to a guy who looked like me. For all he knew, I would turn around and sell them on the street to some strung-out junkie who didn't know any better. He said that Vic had called, saying he was too sick to make it to the hospital to get his prescription filled. He looked me in the eye and said they weren't those kind of pills that stoners take, which pissed me off more, that they weren't those kind of pills, or that he knew that I was thinking. Then he patted me on the shoulder and said I was a good kid he could trust. I wanted to sock him. I took the bottle and tried to make sense of the label, figure out what kind of pills they were. It didn't make sense that Vic was sick. I had seen him the day before hoeing away at his patch of dirt. I asked the pharmacist what was wrong with Vic. Maybe he shouldn't have told me, but he did. Vic had cancer. I asked him what kind, and he just shook his head. Oh, I thought, that kind. When I rode up, Vic was working in his garden, making me wonder what he meant when he told the pharmacist he was feeling sick. Sat on my bike, watching him for a few minutes. He was moving slowly, but he wasn't coughing up blood or bent over in pain. Got off my bike and walked over to him, handing him the pills. He just smiled and said, "Thank you." He completely weirded me out. I mean, here he was ready to drop dead at any moment. and he was then acting like I just delivered a pizza. Vic said something in a soft voice, which I couldn't quite catch. What? Do you want to come in for a beer? He asked. His voice was just some wind coming up from his chest, forming into words along the way. He asked so sweetly, and while I was trying to think of a way to say no, he turned and walked into his house. I stood watching the screen door slap shut, wanting to turn around and leave, but knowing I would follow. I stepped into the dark house from the bright sun, taking my first few steps blindly. My first impression was the smell. His house smelled like medicine and old people. It permeated the air. It wasn't a bad smell, but nowhere I had ever hung out smelled that way. As my vision adjusted, I saw the sparse decorations. The furniture was old, but not old enough to be trendy or antique. It was obvious that he didn't take as much care inside as he did outside. We sat at his green linoleum kitchen table, sipping cheap beer from cans. I felt weird, self-conscious, knowing this guy sitting across the table had a clock ticking. It's a nice motorcycle you got, Vic finally said. I shook my head. Not really. It's about to fall apart, and when it does, it's not going to be worth fixing. It looks pretty good to me, he said. I shrugged. When you live in the city, it doesn't pay to have a nice bike. I explained. Nice motorcycles get stolen all the time. No one would bother to steal that piece of junk. Oh, he said, letting it sink in. We sat in silence for a few minutes while I knocked back the tiny backwash at the bottom of the can. I was just about to get up and say goodbye when Vic looked at me and asked, What are you, 25 years old? I shook my head. 22. His eyes opened wide and he smiled, nodding as if I had just answered one of the world's greatest mysteries. That's how old I was when I got married. It seemed to mean something to him, but I was missing it. It seems kind of young to get married, I said. Sure is, he said. I didn't know what I was doing, but it seems to have worked out okay. He pulled out an old wallet. The leather was bulging, but not because of any money or credit cards. He started showing me old photos of his wife and kids, flipping through them carefully. Even though he handled them gently, they were worn and cracked, making me think he did this a lot. Each photo had a date and a story. I'm known for being rude to my friends, which probably explained why I didn't have any, but I just sat and listened to Vic, not knowing why. I couldn't figure out what it was about, this old man, that made me look at the pictures of his boring life. Whatever it was, he had it. He spoke slowly in his voice that was a little more than a whispered lullaby. He had this way of waiting in between each sentence, thinking of what to say next, that made me think he was just about to make a really profound point. But he never did. It was always just another graduation or grandchild or prom, just another photo in Vic's boring life. It drove me crazy, but pretty soon I was filling in those pauses and asking him all kinds of questions. He got another can of beer and popped it open. After a while, when the beer was almost gone and the dregs were too warm and skunky to drink, I started feeling pretty spooked. I was talking to this guy knowing that the clock was running, and he had a disease running around inside of him, killing him a bit more with every second he was sitting there. His life was ticking away. Hanging out with me, going through his crappy old photos, seemed a sorry way to spend his remaining few moments. It bothered me, but Vic didn't seem to mind. More than any other person I'd ever spoken with, Vic was in no rush. A few days later, I stopped my bike to watch him pull weeds, which were just about the only things I saw growing in his garden patch. When he saw me, his eyes lit up. He stood up, taking a break to be neighborly. I got more beers for you, he said. He'd hurried into his house, telling me to wait until he got back. I wanted so much to kick my starter and ride away, but a voice inside my head said, What did you expect when you stopped? Admit it, you liked the guy. Vic watched me take the first sip of beer. I was about to say something polite, like thanks for the suds, when it just fell out of my mouth. What's it like knowing that you're going to die? I expected a pseudo-philosophical, we're all going to die eventually line, or maybe he would get uptight about me asking. But Vic didn't do either of those. He didn't even flinch. He answered as if I'd asked him what fertilizer he used on his tomatoes. He sipped his beer, reading the label on the can for a moment while he thought about what I had asked. He answered in his thin, old man voice. It's really not a big deal. at least not the way most people think. The way I figure it, when you die, you go live in a town, pretty much like the town you lived in your whole life, with the same people. It seems to be the nature of people to be together. We could live any way we want, but when we want to get real, we come close to each other. So I figured it must go pretty deep, deeper than just this world. I interrupted. I like being alone. How's that working out for you? Vic said. His question pissed me off, and I was trying to come up with a nasty comeback. But his question had been as simple as he was, with no nastiness intended. The anger was pure me, and realizing that shut me down. I sipped my beer and listened. Vic waited a few minutes before continuing. The way I figure it, after you die, it isn't really so much different than when you're alive. So there have to be towns. And in the center of town, the town that I reside in, is a park full of trees. In one corner, there's a playground, and in the center is a fountain for the kids in the summer. In the corner are a bunch of tables for backgammon and chess. I've always been partial to backgammon, he confided. Everyone has an appointment with God once a week. Some people will just sit with him and feed pigeons. Some play backgammon or chess. The really pure souls stay children forever. When they show up in the park, they go right for the water splashing around in the fountain or play tag. There are even some souls who are so holy that their special job is to push God on the swings when he's feeling down. Listening to him made me numb, and I could barely stand. But I had to speak up. How do you know this? I asked. He shrugged. I don't know, but I just figure it's the way it's got to be. He paused. Actually, maybe a little more than just figuring. I kind of always knew this was true, but that's been getting a lot clearer lately. He took a sip of beer before going on. Well, the way I remember it, I play backgammon with God every Tuesday afternoon. I figure it that way because every Tuesday afternoon I felt kind of lost, like I should be doing something important. But I couldn't remember what it was. Now I know. I bring the popcorn, and God brings the iced tea. We sit and play backgammon, listening to the children laugh, talking about whatever comes into our heads. Once in a while, I'd say something interesting, and God would say, Hey, Vic, I've never heard that before. How would you like to check it out and get back to me? So my soul would go looking for a body, and a new Vic would be born in the world in order to try out my idea. Then I would die, and the next Tuesday, I'd be sitting there in the park playing backgammon with God. We'll play for a bit, munching popcorn and sipping iced tea. And after a little while, God will ask, Oh, by the way, how did that idea of yours turn out? So I tell him. Some people forget what idea they came down to check out. Some people even forget there's a town or park. Some people go so far as to go around harumphing and denying that they ever played backgammon at all. Or they say there is no park. Can you imagine that? Vic shook his head in disbelief. They start to hold on tight to the temporary illusion, saying this is the only reality. All they want is this world. My experience is those people tend to be angry. And they think life is all about them, so a lot of them never even have kids. Vic shook his head again, alarmed at the thought. Kids are beautiful. They just came from the park, so they still live by the rules of the park. They relate to everyone like they would relate to God, angels, souls, anyone they were used to meeting in the park. Some old people are happy. They're looking forward to Tuesday. They have some really nice things to tell God, some pleasant conversation about how they tried to make this world more like the park. They've never forgotten which things God likes to talk about. Some old folks look back and worry that they won't have enough to talk about. There are others that walk around thinking they have all the answers already. They've collected so much stuff and nonsense in this world, and they think that is all this, all this is their power and strength. Can you imagine sitting down in front of God and trying to impress him with your stock portfolio? Vic snorted a laugh. He reached back and pulled out his wallet, the cracked black leather bulging, looking enormous in his shriveled hands. I got some pictures to show God this time around. The beer had gone warm, but I sucked it down because I had to get out of there. I wanted to be alone to think about everything Vic had just told me. I had a lot of questions, but I never did hang out with Vic again. I left home that winter, and Vic did too, heading south to his kids in warmer climes. I got a letter from my folks the next summer. They said that when the summer people returned, Vic wasn't with them. I guess those 2 times drinking cheap beer with Vic changed something inside of me. By the end of that summer, I decided that I was sick of being angry. I started to make some changes. Small changes were hard, but then I started to make big changes, and was surprised when they came easier. Moving to a new town, getting a new job, changes that had seemed impossible, were disturbingly quick and easy, making me wonder why I hadn't made them sooner. 30 years later, getting used to being happy is still difficult before a second cup of coffee. Anger's an old habit that fits me like an old coat. I'm not as old as Vic was when he set me straight, but I'm a lot closer than I used to be. I won't lie and say I understood what he said now any better than I did back then, but I'm more sure than ever that he was right. Don't ask me to explain that statement, but I know it's true, at least closer to being right than anything else I've ever heard along the way. I guess that when the door opened up, Vic got up from whatever garden he was raking, brushed off the dirt, and walked through the door. I'd like to think he didn't look back. Yeah, so Vic did live across the street from my parents, and I was an angry young man. And I think I'm closer to understanding Vic, and I think he was right. Thank you all so much.